And then we will get started. All right, so again, welcome everybody. Really excited to be here, be your energizing keynote to get our conversation started today. As Kevin said, my name is Sam Drazin. I am a former elementary educator. I taught elementary school for a number of years, left the classroom about 7 years ago to embark on this new journey. So when I left the classroom, I started a nonprofit organization called Changing Perspectives, which collaborates and partners with schools across the country to really help schools think about how do we create more authentically inclusive learning environments for all students. You might put my email address here on the screen. More than happy to connect with anybody individually after this conference. You're also welcome to reach out on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and other social media platforms. My work in this field is really around kind of partnerships with schools and districts and really assessing where are we? You know, we know that each school, we know that each district is really its own microcosm. It has its own culture. And so really kind of taking the time to get to know what is the culture? What is the community like? What are the current successes around inclusion? And what are the current gaps or needs that need to be addressed? Personally, I come to this work from my own life experience as someone with a disability. I was born with a rare craniofacial anomaly. I wear a bone conductive hearing aid and have had 8 facial reconstructive surgeries. And so I often like to think of myself as someone who's been on both sides of the desk. A student with a difference, and then on the teacher side of the classroom with a difference. Little bit more about the nonprofit. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. As I mentioned, we partner and collaborate with schools and districts to really support an emphasis on social emotional learning, as well as cultivating inclusive and equitable learning communities through the lens of students with disabilities. We do that through pre-K through high school curriculum resources, educator professional development trainings, and also parent programs. Our website is up on the screen. It's www.changingperspectivesnow.org, as well as you can reach out to us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So again, more than happy to connect with anybody after this conference if they'd like to learn more about Changing Perspectives, what we do and how we do it, and how we might be able to support you today. But without further ado, let's really jump in to what we're talking about today, which is how do we design inclusive preschools? How do we do it? How do we consider the current myths, the barriers, and the creative solutions? So I want to start with a story. I want to share a story with you, which was my light bulb moment, my aha moment around the value of inclusion. So when I was teaching 3rd grade one year, I had a student in my class who was diagnosed with apraxia. So she was 3rd grade, but nonverbal. And one day I was talking to her mom, and her mom and I decided that it might be a good idea to start talking with the rest of her classmates about this individual student and her differences. So one morning at morning meeting, we gathered the students together. And the special educator was there, the one-on-one para-educator was there, the mom was there, as well as the student. And the para and mother and special educator jumped right in and shared a little bit with the students about their classmate, how she's different, how she's learning things at a different rate and in a different way. After they gave their kind of summary, we opened it up to the students and said, do you have any questions? And they all looked at each other. And it's kind of become taboo to talk about disabilities. We've kind of created a system in school systems where we don't really talk about disability. And so finally, one brave student raised their hand and said, well, what does she like to do on the weekends? And her mom said, well, she likes to ride her bike and she likes to play with her sister and she likes to watch TV shows. And another student raised their hand and said, well, what TV shows does she like? And her mom said, well, she likes SpongeBob and she likes this and she likes that. And another student raised their hand and said, I like those TV shows too. 3/4 of the remaining conversation was the classmates making comparisons to how they were the same as their classmate with apraxia rather than how they were different. And as an educator, that was really what I like to describe as my light bulb moment for inclusion, my aha moment, my wake up of like, wow, when we as adults push our comfort zones, when we push the barriers of our systems and create opportunities to engage, opportunities to talk, opportunities to create safe, respectful learning environments, that's when inclusion happens. And that oftentimes it can actually be fueled by the students. We want to encourage students today to be the leaders for inclusion of tomorrow. So as we talk about inclusion today, I really, really encourage everybody on this call to think about what is your light bulb moment? What was your light bulb moment in this field around inclusion? And I think it's a really great way to start thinking about how we change systems, how we change structures, how we change policies, starting with those stories, thinking about what was that moment that you had as an educator, the moment you had as a parent, the moment you had maybe when you were a student. We all had different moments, but what was that moment for you? I encourage you to really think about that today. And as you think about what your moment is today, I really encourage you to reflect on that moment. And I've put together a few questions that I would encourage you to think about, or maybe bring back to your school or your district. I think a great activity is to have folks in your school or in your district share what is their inclusion aha moment and debrief with folks. What surprised you about that? For me, the story I shared, I thought that the students were going to ask questions about learning more about the difference, not jumping immediately to the similarities. Why did this moment shift your perspective on inclusion? Did you have fears about that moment? How was that experience perceived by your colleagues? And really, what were the biggest lessons learned? So I share that story with you to kind of kickstart, get the gears going, get the juices flowing around what was your light bulb moment for inclusion, and what questions can you ask yourself to reflect on that. So let's shift the conversation a little bit and talk about disability. I think disability is a really interesting minority group, a very interesting thing to consider when we think about diversity or creating equitable and inclusive learning environments. One of the things that I think is so important to remember is that disability is the largest minority in the world. Disability is actually the only minority that crosses all races, all genders, folks from all different socioeconomic groups. Disabilities are also things you could be born with or acquire for an illness, an accident. Disabilities are prevalent in all family structures, people who have all ethnicities and all religious backgrounds. And I think sometimes we forget that. I think sometimes we kind of think about disability in a very kind of tunnel vision sort of way. And also recognize that when we're thinking about students with disabilities, recognizing that disability is just one piece that makes up their whole identity. That we have students with disabilities of different races, disabilities of different genders, of different socioeconomic groups. We really want to be mindful of all of the different, I like to think about a puzzle, all of the different pieces of identity that make up the full puzzle of a particular student who happens to also be a student living with a specific disability. We also need to remind ourselves that there are both invisible and visible disabilities. And I want to unpack that a little bit more. You know, one of the challenges sometimes around invisible disabilities for schools and systems and educators is they're not obvious at first glance. We don't necessarily know there's a disability. Their peers might not know there's a disability. And sometimes with invisible disabilities, especially when we think about students who are EBD, emotional behavioral disturbed, it can be harder to naturally empathize with those students. That sometimes as practitioners, we just get frustrated or annoyed that things aren't going our way, right? We recognize that with all disabilities, there's a spectrum. There's a wide range from mild to severe. With invisible disabilities, it often might take time to fully realize what the strengths are of the individual student, as well as what are the limitations. And in doing that, we have to think more creatively about our accommodations. How do we accommodate the student? How do we create an authentically inclusive learning environment? When we jump over to the side of visible disabilities, a few things to consider there. We really want to think about that how invisible disabilities are much more obvious. But sometimes when they're obvious, we can jump to stereotypes or our implicit biases can come out a little more easily. It may be easier to create, It may be easier to create accommodations for students with visible disabilities, or we may think we know what accommodations they need because they're more obvious. Visible disabilities, again, you could be born with or you can acquire later in life. And as practitioners, we might more quickly assume things or make assumptions about one's identity if their disability is more visible. So I want to share a short video clip with you. This is about 30 seconds long. It's actually a French advertisement. What this video clip shows is what the world would be like if individuals with disabilities were the majority and individuals without were the minority. I'm going to say that one more time to make sure everyone got me. What this video shows is what the world would be like if people with disabilities were the majority and people without were the minority. And as you watch this video, I want you to notice what are all of the things that are challenging for the people without disabilities to do. So again, as you watch this video, I want you to notice what are all of the daily tasks that the individuals without apparent disabilities try to do and find it much more challenging.
Hello, I'd like to open a bank account. One is the loneliest number that you'll ever do. Two can be as bad as one. It's the loneliest number since the number one. Access for everyone. When your world lights up, EDF.
What I'd like you to do right now is if there was something you noticed in the video that made it challenging for the people without disabilities to perform a pretty simple daily task, throw it in the chat right now. Let's kind of take a moment to blow up the chat of what were all of the observations you noticed around how this world designed for people with disabilities made it awfully challenging for people without disabilities. And as you're throwing these things in the chat, I'll just talk a little bit more about that. What I think is so neat and so kind of apparent in this video is very, very short, but it really gets our gears thinking about how our society, how our systems, how our classrooms are designed typically for individuals without disabilities, and how all of these kind of daily things like opening up a bank account, getting a book from the library, crossing the street, asking somebody for help can be challenging when our world is designed just through that one lens. I want to show the video to you one more time. And if you notice anything different the second time through that you didn't notice the first time, you can also throw that in the chat.
Hello, I'd like to open a bank account. One is the loneliest number that you'll ever do. Two can be as bad as one. It's the loneliest number since the number one. Access for everyone. When your world lights up, EDF.
So as we think about inclusion and inclusive practices today, let's think about what current systems, what current structures in our preschool environments need to be changed to be more accessible to those without disabilities. So who are California's preschool children? California has roughly 1 million preschool students between the ages of 3 and 4. And from some statistics in the 2018-2019 school year, again, this is an average, it varies county by county, but there's roughly 36.5% of the preschool students in California have some sort of diagnosed disability. So that's a pretty big percentage if you think about it. Now, this chart shows students with disabilities considering least restrictive environment. Again, this is from the similar program year of 2018 to 2019. And one of the things that you'll notice is that down below, it shows that the gray bar represents students that are in a gen ed setting, and that the purple bluish bar represents students that are in a separate setting, so not included versus included. And that it's pretty interesting that the ones that are in separate settings, those percentages seem to be much higher compared to the ones that are in the same setting. So I think it's just a really interesting chart to see kind of how this is distributed. And as Kevin said in the introduction, all of these slides could be shared with you after today's presentation if you'd like any of this as well. So again, another graphic to talk more about the data. Again, there is substantial variance in the percentage of preschoolers with IEPs throughout the state of California by county. It ranges anywhere between 4% and as high as 83%, with that state average being 36.5. You'll notice that the red colored counties are on the lower end of 4%. And as you go up to the green colored counties, those are on the higher end of up to 83%. So the point I'm trying to get across here is, as we talk about students with disabilities, specifically at the preschool level, we are talking about a large majority of our young learners throughout the state of California. I wanted to include in our keynote, as a way to kind of just get us energized and thinking, some of my favorite quotes around diversity and inclusion. So this is a quote by Verna Myers, and it reads, "Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance." And I really love that quote whenever I'm doing work around inclusion, because I think it's just such a great visual. I mean, you can really close your eyes and see folks, mingling at some sort of party or gathering. And it's one thing to be there and be sitting on the outskirts watching. It's another thing for someone to come up to you and say, "Hey," and hold out their hand. "Do you want to dance?" And being on the dance floor and collectively engaged in the activity together. So I've started out this keynote by sharing with you a little bit about myself. We then talked about disability being the largest minority in the world, the difference between invisible and visible disabilities, and our perceptions of disability. Now what I'd like to do is kind of shift gears and talk about inclusion. So I want to share with you a part of a larger clip. This is from Edmonton, Canada, and it's a superintendent talking about his perspective on, and really his definition of what is inclusive education. And the quote that I pulled out from the video that I titled this slide with, "Not excluded intentionally, by design, or unintentionally," I think is incredibly powerful. So again, I'm gonna click play, but I'm only gonna play about a minute or two, and then I'll stop it.
My challenge to leaders 5 years ago when I stepped into this role: how do we create a district where everybody's in and not excluded intentionally, by design, or unintentionally? When we're talking about inclusive education, it's how do we make sure everybody's in, everybody has a place, and that they are participating. How we do that is something that we're constantly learning, because it's a big challenge for us. When I think about inclusive education, learning is the core work of a school district, but in a school, we actually establish our own school-based community where kids have a place, they have roles to play, that the adults work together with the kids. And so in that little community called a school, kids learn not only the academic requirements, the learner outcomes, but they also learn how to get along, they also learn how to manage conflict, they learn a whole variety of citizenship skills and knowledge related to learning how to work and live together. We see some unique features in all of the schools that are really a school personality, right? That emerges, and that's one of the great features, I think, of paying attention to and being responsive to what's going on in the community.
So I just love how that superintendent starts his conversation about inclusive education by talking about how do we create a place where everybody's in, not excluded intentionally, by design, or unintentionally. So what I would challenge all of us to do is to think about, what does inclusion mean to you? What is your personal definition of inclusion? And if you want to throw it in the chat, you're more than welcome to. If you want to just, write it down on a sticky note or a Post-it note, if you want to just think to yourself, go for it. But I think inclusion, we all come to this from our own past life experiences, personally and professionally. And I really encourage schools and districts to work together collaboratively to really come up with their own kind of school-wide or classroom-wide or district-wide. What is our definition of inclusion? Because I think in order to create inclusive preschools, we need to first ensure that we all have an understanding, we all have come to an agreement, a consensus about our definition of inclusive practice. I really like using the term authentic inclusion. I think there is, it's very easy to say that our students are included. It's much harder to say that our students are authentically included into the classroom, into the school, have a sense of belonging. So I would really encourage you today, as you kind of work through this conference, to think about, what is your definition of an inclusive preschool for students with disabilities? I think oftentimes when we think about inclusion, it can feel very overwhelming. And it can almost become paralyzing in some ways. Like, oh my gosh, like, how am I supposed to do this? How am I supposed to do this? And so one of the things that I like to think about is unpacking inclusion into three different domains. But when we think about creating authentically inclusive learning environments for our youngest learners, we need to ensure that we're creating opportunities for students to feel included within the academics. We need to make sure that students feel physically included in the classroom environment, cafeteria environment, playground environment. And we also need to ensure that students feel socially included. So what does this mean? And how does this work? So when we think about academic inclusion, I think about how are the academics accessible to all students? How are we not just differentiating academic instruction and opportunities, but how are we differentiating it where all students can access it at the same time in the same classroom? When we think about physical inclusion, I think most people jump to ADA and think about, do we have the ramps and do we have Braille and do we have the height of the water fountains and all of that? But I would encourage us to push ourselves a step further and think about how is the design of our classroom inclusive to all students, students who have sensory sensitivity. How are we including physical objects like, stress balls, different types of seats, different seating arrangements, different lighting opportunities, how are we aware of the sounds that are happening? Any sort of kind of almost like considering all of the five senses and ensuring that all of the five senses are not pushing students out of the classroom, but actually welcoming students in, creating a physical environment where students feel safe physically, creating a physical environment where students can focus, creating a physical environment where students are feeling a sense of calm, a sense of safety, both physical safety as well as emotional safety. I often talk with students about we want to make sure that our bodies and our hearts feel safe. And then lastly, how do we create an environment that is socially inclusive? How do we empower students to understand their classmates? How do we empower all faculty, paraeducators, OT, SLPs, folks that are on playground duty, on duty in the cafeteria? How do we empower them to be facilitators of social inclusion, especially during those kind of more unstructured times, those play times for our young learners? I really encourage you, rather than feeling maybe overwhelmed by inclusion as a whole, to compartmentalize inclusion into these three domains. I think it'll make it much easier for you. One strategy that I often share with schools is creating your own inclusive checklist, almost like your own self-assessment. So think about what questions would you want to ask yourself to evaluate how academically inclusive your current systems are. What questions could you ask yourself to evaluate how physically inclusive your systems and classrooms are? And what questions could you ask yourself to evaluate or assess how socially inclusive your environments are for these young learners? And by writing down and creating a list of questions, that can really be a great starting place to think about where are we already succeeding. Maybe you're already doing a great job in academic inclusion, and social inclusion is what you need to work on. Maybe there's bits and pieces of all of these domains that you have strengths and you also have gaps. I think it's really easy when we talk about this to think about, oh, we're doing all of this just for this one subset of our population. But in fact, what we've learned is that when we create inclusive environments, authentically inclusive environments for preschool students, that it benefits all students. And one of the best examples I like to use when I think about UDL, Universal Design for Learning, is how our sidewalks dip down when there's a crosswalk. And I think this is just like the best visual, concrete example. So, the sidewalks dip down to go into a crosswalk for students or for individuals who might be using a wheelchair. But think about all of the other people that this change in our infrastructure throughout our cities support. Elderly people that are walking with canes, young children that don't need a huge step down, parents that are pushing strollers, people that are using bikes. That this is just such a concrete example about UDL, this one little shift in how cities use their sidewalks to their crosswalks has helped so many people well beyond the initial population of individuals that are using wheelchairs to move around. Inclusion for a few equals benefits for many. So let's unpack this a little bit more. So we know that when we create an inclusive environment for all students, that it helps children develop a positive understanding of themselves and others, right? When we create a diverse learning opportunity for students to engage with students who navigate the world in a little bit of a different way, who have different lived experiences, who have a different set of strengths and a different set of needs, that students are able to reflect on themselves and in do so boost their own self-awareness of themselves, but also boost their social awareness, their perspective, their empathy of others. When we create diverse and inclusive learning environments for students with and without disabilities, friendships develop. And if we can help students at the youngest level develop friendships of students who are different from them, that will transpire throughout their entire lives. I think one of the biggest reasons that we have so much exclusion, so many instances of bullying, intolerance of students with disabilities in the middle school and high school level is because these students were never given an opportunity to engage, to learn, to work alongside and form those such important friendships at a young age. Learning with specialized instruction as appropriate is facilitated for all children. When we move from a pull-out model to a push-in model, and OTs and SLPs and PTs are coming and working within the general ed classroom, we know that not just the students with an IEP benefit from those specialized instruction opportunities. I put together this graph that I wanted to talk about that, we're doing this work for students with disabilities at the core. But what happens is when we start to create new systems, new processes, new structures, as we start to move away from inclusion to authentic inclusion, academic, physical, and social, for students with disabilities, the ripple effect, the positive impacts and benefits go out from those students at the core with disabilities to the general ed students that now they're engaging with on a daily basis, to supporting all educators in becoming greater advocates, more well-versed in students with disabilities, and it really trickles all the way out to families at home. And so I thought that this graphic was just another way to illustrate how when we do some work here, that the benefits really ripple out, almost like when you throw a pebble in a pond and you see that ripple effect. So this really is a continuum of inclusion. When we create inclusive environments, authentically inclusive environments, if we can work together with our colleagues to come up with a consistent mission definition of what inclusive education means to us, if we can compartmentalize how we can address academic, physical, and social inclusion, and we start that at the youngest of preschool, the success rate, the positive impacts, the ripple effect that students are going to have from preschool to kindergarten to elementary, middle, high school, all the way to post-secondary education is going to be so powerful. And it's really, I believe, the stepping stone to creating a society, a nation that really is more inclusive of students of all abilities and or disabilities. So I really like to think about it rather than a circle that ends necessarily. It's a continuum. It's a line that just goes out into infinity. And it starts with what we're doing here today at this conference. So I hope that I have been able to energize you today. I hope that I've been maybe able to empower you, giving you some new food for thought, give you some aha moments, things that you can take back to your schools and districts to think about. So how do we move forward? How do we move forward with this work? Well, I think one of the things we need to think about is doing this one bite-sized time, but one bite size at a time, right? There's a lot of work to be done. It's not going to be done overnight. But if we think about one little piece at a time to build a bigger puzzle, I encourage you to walk away from today's conference with at least one thing, one tool, one strategy, one new perspective that you can go back to your home district or school and use to inspire greater conversation and hopefully the beginning of some actionable change. I want to leave you with another quick video. This is from a school district in the Midwest, and it's parents of students with disabilities at the preschool level talking about the value of meaningful inclusion in early childhood.
I felt nervous, very nervous. I was with him full time, and then to hand him over is nerve-wracking.
It's mostly fear of the unknown. I didn't know how we would fare in a classroom setting with all those typically developing kids, and then how we would understand those instructions and those lessons that are being taught by the teachers.
In early childhood, every classroom is an inclusive classroom. Whether you're talking about children with abilities or just children that have had different life experiences up until this point. You look at your environment differently, and how is the environment accessible to every child? And how is your environment set up so that every child is getting exactly what they need?
Our mission and vision statement are anchored in high expectations and outcomes for all students. So living that out at the early childhood level, that was the work.
I think it all starts with that IEP process. So really having that evaluation team and the current team writing those functional goals and objectives. My goal is that services such as speech, OT, PT, all those could be embedded right within the classroom and the routines that we have.
When you are an early childhood kid between 3 and 5 years old, you want to do what your friends are doing. And to have children, the expectation that they're going to sit and do one specific thing at any given time that you choose doesn't always work out. But when it's an itinerant model, having those service providers coming into the environment, working with kids, doing things that kids are naturally doing is in the best interest of kids.
We used to have our kids that are the kids in childcare, and then our kids with IEPs that were joining that group. So it kind of starting out to meeting those needs more individually, which has really turned into that all that joint ownership. all kids belong, both reg ed and special ed teacher and therapists too, that we all are a team for every child.
I think teachers learn from other teachers. And so when you have special education people in there, whether it's an OT or a PT or a speech person or just a special education teacher, they are modeling different behaviors or using different words that as the regular ed teacher, you can listen and go, oh, I may be able to use that with another child.
He's learning in class, he's engaged in class, he has relationships.
Before, we were like thinking maybe we're going to be there for the rest of our lives to support him with all the needs that he got. But we are so happy to see that he can really do the things that he can do right now. Those skills has developed so much. He can truly create something wonderful, and that really makes us very proud.
I think what we know now is that there are more questions than there are answers, and to be open to every opportunity that you are given to learn and to develop always what's in the best interest of the child, and to give them those opportunities to show you what they need and to listen to them.
It makes me really optimistic for his future. You know, I used to worry a lot about, would he fit in? Would he get picked on? How would his classroom environment be? But he has become quite the popular guy at school. So he comes into class and I can't even tell you how many kids hug him. He has true friendships, true relationships in class. And he brings a special just energy to his class. And it's positive for his classmates too, to see that.
I hope inclusion promotes awareness to those typically developing kids that there are other kids like our son that need support as they try to learn their way through life.
There's a softness there, there's an empathy there that I see in his peers. And we didn't expect that, but we love it.
We know that young children need a variety of rich experiences with all of their peers. And we also know that not only children with, but those without disabilities benefit from inclusive environments. Wisconsin's vision, every child a graduate, college and career ready, is not possible unless our children with disabilities have the opportunity for meaningful participation in their classrooms, in their schools, and in their communities. Now is the time to get past the hurdles. Whether you work in private or public school settings, in center or family-based childcare, Head Start or special education services, every one of us will be able to take great joy in making a difference for our kids and their families. As you move toward inclusive environments, if you are in need of assistance, feel free to contact the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. We'd be more than happy to help. Thank you.
So I love that video. I really enjoy hearing from the parents' perspective on this work, and hopefully it kind of gives you some energy as we move forward with today's presentations.
I felt nervous.
So let's use this as a springboard, as an opportunity to rebuild the architecture of our preschool settings to create a more authentically inclusive environment for all students. I want to end with one more quote. Diversity is a fact, equity is a choice, inclusion is an action, belonging is an outcome. I want to thank Kevin and the Supporting Inclusive Practices team for inviting me to be your keynote presenter today. I hope I've inspired you, and I'm really looking forward to the breakout sessions and the panelists that we'll be going into next. As I mentioned, if anyone wants to follow up with me, I'm more than happy to follow up with anyone individually on my work and how I might be able to support you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. So much of what you said really resonated. A couple things. This idea of talking about disability, putting it out in the open